The morning sun hadn't even climbed over the edge of the auto shop's rusted metal roof when Jake Turner pushed open the back door with his shoulder, carrying a steaming cup of gas station coffee in one hand and his toolbox in the other. The familiar smell of motor oil and steel hit him like a welcome hug. This place wasn't pretty, but it was home. At least it had been for the last 6 years. He clocked in quietly, like he always did, and made his way to Bay 3, where a dented Ford pickup waited for him like a loyal dog waiting for its owner to return. Jake wasn't much of a talker. The town knew him as the guy who kept his head down, worked hard, and didn't cause trouble. But beneath the grease-stained shirt and calm eyes was a man who carried the kind of loyalty and compassion money couldn't buy. He'd learned it from his grandfather, a man who could barely afford groceries but never let a stranger go hungry. Jake lived by that same rule, even if his boss, Rick Dalton, hated it. Rick Dalton, owner of Dalton Auto Repair, liked two things: money and control. He strutted around the shop like he owned the whole town instead of just a dingy building on the corner of Maple Street. He wore polished boots that never touched a drop of oil, a gold chain that glinted even under the dim shop lights, and a permanent scowl that made customers nervous and employees even more so. Jake had barely set his coffee down when he heard the unmistakable sound of Rick's angry footsteps. Fast, heavy, sharp. Great, Jake thought. He must have found something to yell about already. "Turner!" Rick barked, loud enough that even the customers in the waiting area flinched. "You better not be slacking on that truck. The owner's already breathing down my neck." Jake didn't bother turning around. "Started 5 minutes ago, boss." "Well, work faster," Rick snapped. "And don't forget, you cost me money with that little stunt yesterday." Jake paused, tools in hand. He knew exactly what Rick was referring to. A stranded mom had come in just before closing time, panicked because her car was billowing smoke and she didn't have enough money for the tow fee. Jake had stayed an hour after his shift and fixed it himself. No charge. Rick had found out. Rick always found out. And he always made sure Jake paid for it. Before Jake could respond, the shop door creaked open behind him. He turned, and there she was, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, clutching a faded purse to her chest. She wore a knitted cardigan despite the warm day, and her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun. Her eyes searched the shop nervously, skipping over Rick's glare and landing on Jake's calm, steady face. "Excuse me," she said softly. I'm sorry to bother you, but my car won't start. I stopped at the grocery store across the street, and it just died." Jake wiped his hands on a rag. "Sure thing, ma'am. Let me take a look." Rick stepped in front of him like a guard dog. "No, he won't." The old woman blinked. I'm sorry?" Rick folded his arms. "We're busy. If your car broke down, call a tow truck like everyone else." I can't afford that," she stuttered. "My husband used to fix things like this, but he passed last year and—" Jake's chest tightened. "Rick, it'll take me 5 minutes to check it." "No," Rick growled. "We don't do charity here, and you," he jabbed a finger into Jake's shoulder, "need to focus on paying work." The woman lowered her head, embarrassed. Jake stepped around Rick anyway. "I'll help you, ma'am. Don't worry." Rick snapped. "Turner, get back here!" But Jake kept walking, following the woman out to the parking lot where an old beige sedan sat crookedly in a parking space. He popped the hood and immediately spotted the issue. A loose battery cable, rusted around the clamps. He tightened it, cleaned the corrosion with a wire brush he kept in his pocket, and secured everything. It wasn't perfect, but it would get her home. "Try it now," Jake said. The woman slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, then purred to life like it was relieved someone still believed in it. "Oh," she gasped, smiling for the first time. "Bless you, young man, you just saved me." Jake shook his head. "Just doing what I can." But Rick had stormed out the door, face red and twisted with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared. Jake stood tall, helping someone. Rick's voice shook with anger. "You think this is a charity? You think my business runs on good deeds?" She didn't have anyone else.
Jake said calmly. It took 2 minutes. 2 minutes I don't get paid for, Rick spat. Get your stuff, you're done. The woman gasped. You're firing him? For helping me? Rick didn't even look at her. Get off my property, both of you.
Jake stared hard at his boss, then slowly removed his gloves.
If that's what you want. Oh, it is, Rick said with a sneer. I'm finally getting rid of the biggest liability in this shop.
Jake wanted to be angry. He wanted to yell, to argue, to say everything he'd swallowed down for years. But instead, he looked at the old woman who was still sitting behind the wheel, shaking her head in disbelief. Thank you, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Jake offered her a small smile. You don't have anything to be sorry for. But Rick wasn't done. You walk out that door, Turner. You're never coming back, he snapped. Jake nodded once. I know. He walked away, toolbox in hand, heart heavy but conscience clean. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere in town, someone had seen the whole thing unfold. Someone who wasn't going to let Rick Dalton get away with what he'd just done. And in just a few seconds, Rick would learn exactly what regret felt like. Jake walked down Maple Street with his toolbox swinging at his side, each step feeling heavier than the last. The auto shop door slammed behind him like a jail gate closing, and even from the sidewalk he could hear Rick shouting at someone inside, probably another worker he would blame for his own bitterness. Jake didn't know where he was going. He just knew he needed to put space between himself and that building. The sun had climbed higher, warming his back, but it did nothing to soften the ache settling in his chest. 6 years. 6 years of loyalty, extra hours, covering shifts, helping customers Rick didn't care about, and bending over backwards for a boss who never once said thank you. And it all ended because he tightened a battery cable for a grandmother who couldn't afford to be stranded. He paused at a small bench near the bus stop outside the bakery. The scent of fresh bread drifted into the air, reminding him that he hadn't eaten breakfast, just that cheap coffee he grabbed on his way in. He took a long breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't the kind of guy who let emotions get the best of him, but today was different. Today felt personal. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Excuse me, young man, are you all right? Jake looked up to see the old woman he'd helped earlier standing beside him, her hands clasped tightly around her purse strap. Her car was parked safely near the curb now, engine off, but her eyes were full of concern. He forced a small smile. I'm okay, ma'am. Just figuring out my next move. He really fired you? She asked, disbelief coloring her tone. Jake nodded. Yeah, Rick's been looking for a reason for a while, I guess. She sat down beside him on the bench with a sigh that seemed to carry years of weight. My name is Margaret Hayes, she said softly, and I'm so terribly sorry for what happened. You helped me without even thinking twice. The world needs more people like you. Jake shook his head. I didn't do anything special. You did, she insisted gently. You absolutely did. Before Jake could respond, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The windows were tinted, but the engine was too smooth, too quiet to belong to the average Maple Street resident. Jake watched curiously as the back door opened. A tall man stepped out, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than Jake made in 2 months. He was maybe in his late 50s, silver-haired but strong, the kind of person who carried authority the way others carried backpacks. He scanned the sidewalk until his eyes landed on Margaret. There you are, Mom, he said warmly, approaching her. I got your message. Are you feeling all right? Margaret stood and gave him a relieved smile. I'm fine, Michael, but I'm glad you came. There's someone you need to meet. The man, Michael, turned his gaze to Jake, sizing him up carefully, the way someone used to boardrooms and negotiations studies every detail before speaking. This the young man you mentioned? He asked. Margaret nodded. Yes, this is Jake. He helped me, and he was fired because of it. Jake shifted awkwardly. Ma'am, you didn't have to call anyone. I wasn't expecting anything. That's exactly why I did, she said gently. Michael extended his hand. I'm Michael Hayes. Jake shook it. Jake,
Turner. Margaret placed a hand on her son's arm. Jake fixed my car without charging me. When his boss told him not to help, he ignored him anyway, and because of that, the man threw him out. Michael's jaw tightened. Is that so? Jake didn't want to look like he was whining. Look, it's fine. I probably should have asked Rick first. He fired you for helping someone in need? Michael asked, voice low and even. Is that correct? Jake hesitated a moment, then nodded. Yeah, that's about right. Something in Michael's expression shifted. Anger, disappointment, maybe a mix of both. Without saying another word, he turned toward the SUV. Come with me. Jake blinked. Where?
Back to the shop, Michael said simply.
Margaret smiled knowingly. Just trust him, dear. My son. He has a way of handling things.
Jake didn't fully understand, but something about Michael's tone made him follow. He climbed into the SUV with Margaret, sitting quietly while they drove the short distance back to Dalton Auto Repair. The moment the vehicle stopped, Michael stepped out and slammed the door with purpose. Rick, who had been yelling at an employee near the open bay, turned sharply at the sound. Can I help you? Rick barked, eyes narrowing at the sight of a well-dressed stranger marching across his lot. Michael didn't slow down. Are you Rick Dalton, owner of this establishment? Rick stood straighter, puffing out his chest. Yeah, who's asking? Michael stopped in front of him, cold and calm. I am Michael Hayes, CEO of Hayes Automotive. We manufacture over 50% of the parts your shop buys wholesale. Rick's face drained of color. Two workers nearby froze mid-step. Jake blinked from where he stood near the SUV. Hayes Automotive wasn't just a company, it was the company, the biggest automotive parts supplier in the state. Look, Mr. Hayes, Rick stammered, if this is about a shipment delay... It's not, Michael cut sharply. It's about your treatment of my mother. Rick's mouth snapped shut. My mother, Michael continued, the woman you dismissed, belittled, and sent away because she couldn't afford your toffee. Rick swallowed hard. I didn't know she was your kid. That's the problem, Michael said, voice rising just slightly. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with decency. Rick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. And then, Michael went on, you fired the one employee who did the right thing, the one man on this entire lot who showed compassion and integrity.
Jake felt heat rise to his cheeks, but he stayed quiet.
Michael stared Rick down. Effective immediately, my company will no longer supply your shop with parts. Your account is terminated. Rick stopped breathing. Double-ish what? You can't do that. I can, Michael said firmly, and I just did. Margaret stepped out of the SUV then, her presence small but powerful. She looked at Rick with disappointment in her eyes. Kindness is free, she said softly. You should try it sometime. Rick looked ruined, his face collapsing as reality hit him. Michael turned to Jake. As for you, I'd like to offer you a job. Jake blinked in shock. Me? Yes, we could use a mechanic with your heart and your skills. Full benefits, better pay, real respect. Jake exhaled, stunned. Margaret smiled proudly. You deserve this, dear. For the first time that day, Jake felt hope bloom in his chest. Rick watched helplessly as the mechanic he'd thrown away stepped into a future far brighter than anything that shop could offer. And in that moment, Rick Dalton understood what regret really felt like.